Good day and welcome to CDI Talks. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov and I'm the chair of the Center for Democratic Integrity, an Austria-based NGO that analyzes attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence politics and societies in Europe. My guest today is Ivana Karásková. She's a project lead and China analyst at the Prague-based Association for International Affairs. There she founded the project Map Influence CE that focuses on both China's and Russia's influence in the Visegrad region. Ivana is also a European China Policy Fellow at the Mercator Institute in Germany and a researcher at the Central European Digital Media Observatory based at Charles University in the Czech Republic. While in Prague, I sat down with Ivana to discuss China's influence in Central Europe and beyond, as well as China's position on the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. I hope our conversation will help you better understand the problems associated with the presence of the Chinese Communist Party in Europe. If you find this talk useful, do like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay updated on future episodes of CDI Talks. Ivana, thank you very much for an opportunity to talk to you. And I'm going to talk to you about China and its influence in Europe and the Czech Republic and the region. In one of your pieces, you wrote that China is a newcomer to the region, and I'm talking about Central Eastern Europe. And but this, I think, influence started with the economic cooperation. China established, I think, a range of institutions for economic cooperation. But when was the moment then this influence could be described as malign influence, if we can use this word? When did it start?
Well, thank you, Anton, very much for having me. It's an interesting question. I think that we shouldn't separate political influence and economic influence. Chinese offer was 16+1 with a format of 16 Central and Eastern European countries, and China, which it initiated in 2012, was essentially political, economic from the very beginning. So we, in Central and Eastern European countries, had a tendency to focus just on economic benefits, basically downplaying or not being even aware of the fact that China comes with a full package. And the package is really not only about investment, it's also about building people-to-people relations, about government-to-government relations, power diplomacy, and the full package as I described that. So when we talk about the influence from the beginning, we can't really say that it was economic per se and then only politically it started to be problematic. When China came as the newcomer, it was based on wrong assumptions from both sides, which I alluded into already. China thought that Central and Eastern European countries are essentially developing countries. And the narrative is still out there that Czech Republic, Poland, Estonia, you name it, are basically part of the global south, which may have been laughable for some of the countries. It was also unpleasant for, let's say, the Baltic countries, which were quite surprised that they were seen as post-communist countries. It was also quite uncomfortable for Poland, which definitely don't perceive itself as a global south or a developing country. So there was this really bad axiom at the beginning of the Chinese approach to Central and Eastern European countries. And the 16+1 essentially was modeled according to very similar formats China had with Latin American countries, with African countries, and so on. And China didn't take into consideration that some of those countries are NATO members, some are not. Some of those countries are EU members, some are not. And there is actually a huge difference among the regions. So this is not a homogeneous region. So it made initially quite a lot of mistakes. That the initially wrong analysis was also done on the CEE side, on Central and Eastern European side, because they thought that China is going to be one another Asian investors, such as South Korea, such as Japan, such as Taiwan, which historically have been present here more and basically invested in this region more. So there were a period of quite unpleasant surprises, I would say, on both sides.
Was it improvising then? When you said that it didn't know or it did not distinguish between NATO member states and EU member states and non-EU member states, was it improvising?
It was, but it took them quite some time to actually understand that there is a difference among those countries. But China has been on a very interesting learning curve for the past 10 years. So if we basically put ourselves into the shoes of Beijing, it's quite admirable actually how they though, as I said, and you said it as well, they were newcomers and they didn't know how it functioned here. They basically got quite deep into the system. They started to understand political opponents, opposition, democratic parties, non-democratic parties, the local media, alternative media. So after 10 years, I would say that they made quite a huge progress.
Would you say that they aimed at Central Eastern Europe per se, or did they try to use Central Eastern Europe in order to get to Western Europe?
Well, there are these two different narratives. It's difficult to say on which actually, what preceded what, whether the Chinese move towards Central and Eastern European countries was really motivated by the looking for new markets, understanding that this place or this area may be seen as hic sunt leones, like lions live here, like unknown, undeveloped region, which is not part of Western Europe, and it's not specifically in the intimate sphere of Russian influence. So there may be space for Chinese influence. So that may be the consideration at the very beginning, that it would be a nice market for Chinese overproduction, especially after the global financial crisis, that it's basically near to Western markets, that it's a region which needs infrastructure projects and so on. On the other hand, it would be difficult to believe that China was absolutely unaware of the fact that some of the countries actually do belong to certain organizations. And we have seen in the past that China quite cleverly used its influence or its persuasion towards certain countries to actually block the EU decision-making process. It was a case of Hungary, which blocked the joint letter of EU ambassadors describing Chinese atrocities and Chinese human rights abuses. There was another veto by Greece on the South China Sea. So whether they knew it from the beginning or not, they basically learned how to use it.
In contrast to Western Europe, Central Eastern Europe, and I think you've already touched this, Central Eastern Europe seem to have a more positive view towards China, or at the very least they're not considering the threat of China on the same level as the threat coming from Russia. Why is this contrast?
There is no historical direct experience with China to the same level as Central and Eastern Europeans have the experience Soviet Union and Russia later on. So most of it is based on, or was based in previous times, on this fascination with the Chinese market and this almost mythical understanding of China. So lack of direct experience, which is not something which, for example, Asian neighbors of China would be familiar with. They basically do know what China is about and what the Chinese system look like and so on. So Central and Eastern Europeans were quite naive when it came to China. Some of the political elites and economic entrepreneurs were subscribing to the narrative that China is post-communist, even that it's basically evolved, it's a market economy and so on. So why not to have a good business relationship with China? And as I already said when I was responding to your first question, there was not deep understanding of really what the initiatives are about, which China is promoting at the very beginning. So the lack of historical knowledge is one of the reasons. The other one is that Central and Eastern European countries mostly during the Cold War belonged to the Soviet camp. So we had a tendency to look at China as the, let's say, not the arch enemy, but definitely an enemy, not the pure communist system. And there was not much of the real studies of Chinese thoughts, of Chinese ideology, and so on. So lots of sinologists, and there is pretty strong sinology actually in Central and Eastern Europe, focus on language, on traditions, on culture, archaeology, basically safe topics. So after 1989, with the new wave of social sciences being established in Central and Eastern European countries, almost none of them basically focus on modern China. So there was lack of historical knowledge and lack of current knowledge as well.
Would you add to this some economic attraction?
Well, definitely. That's the whole narrative of China being the market of 1.4 billion consumers who are just waiting for your goods to buy it. That's definitely something which has been flying around a lot here. And it took hold specifically after the global financial crisis, where most of the CE countries wanted to diversify, because lots of the economies still until today are mostly West-oriented and dependent on EU markets or partners such as Germany.
And 2 years ago, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think also China was quite successful with its mask diplomacy in Central Eastern Europe. Was it the same in the Czech Republic? Or what do you think about its success, which is not limited, I think, only to masks, but to vaccines and other developments related to the pandemic?
I think that we have to distinguish between EU member states and non-EU member states. China was quite successful in Western Balkans, in non-EU member states, especially during the vaccine diplomacy. During the mask diplomacy, that may be a little bit different story, but especially with the vaccine diplomacy. The other countries which are EU members were basically following the EU lead on that, European Commission lead on that, and the joint procurement and the necessity of the vaccines to be approved by European Medical Agency. So that was quite a different story. In Western Balkans, China scored a lot of points through its mask diplomacy and vaccine diplomacy. In EU member states in Central and Eastern Europe, it was quite less successful, I would argue, than in Western Balkans. So it differed. But it was an interesting period of time when China actually had, or were having the vaccines, Sinopharm and Sinovac vaccines, and it was offering them to other countries, but it didn't offer them en masse to 16+1 countries. And it was a period of time when even EU member states would most likely take it if it was offered, because it was this period of time of dire need. And the Czech Republic was one of the heavily affected country. Unfortunately, more than 30,000 people died. And there was a very short period of time, 2 months probably, where the Prime Minister Andrej Babiš was actually toying with the idea of Russian vaccines and Chinese vaccines, because he thought that EU is very, very slow on that.
And they were not introduced?
They were not introduced. They were not even offered by the Chinese side. There were semi-vague promises saying that you, as member states, you have to ask us, Chinese, and we may deliver it. But it would have been way more successful if China actually put the vaccines on the table and said, now you have it, we are your friend. They didn't do that. It was quite a strategic mistake, but it happened.
What was the rationale of China with these mask and vaccine diplomacy, in your opinion?
We ran a study actually at Choice looking at where China was offering the vaccines. And Chinese narrative about vaccines from the very beginning was that vaccines know no boundaries, as COVID knows no boundaries. So the vaccines are definitely a political thing. That was the Chinese narrative. But when you look at the countries where China actually introduced or offered donations to those countries, these were essentially the countries where China has political interest in. So in Asia, it offered vaccines to ASEAN countries, excluding Vietnam, of course, but all 9 ASEAN countries basically were offered donations, and some actually took it, and some countries then followed with the purchases. Donations came in thousands and tens of thousands. Purchases then came in millions. So it's essentially acted as a drug dealer. You have a free sample here, take it, we are your friend, and then you have to file the purchase. In Latin American countries, China targeted countries which don't have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, which basically subscribe to one China policy as being, or principle as being seen by Beijing. In Western Balkans, it of course offered its vaccines to Serbia, which then distributed it to its neighboring countries. In Europe, only Hungary took Chinese vaccines. And in Africa, the story was quite similar to the story I described when talking about less developed countries and Chinese approach to them.
Going back to China's influence in the Czech Republic and Central Eastern Europe, would you say that China delivered on its promises to the region with investments and all the other economically attractive developments?
Well, definitely not. One probably caveat to make here is that most of the real numbers, specific numbers, basically came from the local politicians. So they cited that China will invest this and that in the, let's say, Czech Republic or in Slovakia. Chinese were more vague about the promises. So it's definitely, they definitely didn't perform well in the region, but to say that they didn't deliver on the promise, because they didn't make the promise quite specific, I would say we have to probably make this distinction. So there was a huge drive actually from the local politicians and local, let's call them political entrepreneurs, former politicians turning basically businessmen, to have positive or good relationship with China. And these were quite instrumental actually in changing foreign policy of certain countries, especially in my home country, the Czech Republic, towards being more China positive.
And who are the main actors of Chinese influence in the Czech Republic?
Well, we made a nice map. It's an interactive map at mapinfluence.eu in English and in Czech language, where you can basically click on any of the intermediary and it will show you the web of relationship. And we utilize the commercial registry to look at which companies are linked to whom and so on. So to start with, if we look at politicians, of course, at the core or at the hub sits the current president, Miloš Zeman, who essentially was, let's say, friendly towards Russia, not necessarily towards China, and later on basically developed this keen interest in China and even thought that this could be his political legacy, that he would be able to, as he said, normalize or rationalize the relationship with People's Republic of China. So he was, of course, quite influential given his premier position in the system. But there were many others. The Social Democratic Party and its members were quite strong as well, having the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So they were quite helpful as well. And then we have a whole list of ex-Social Democratic politicians who turned to start lobby for Chinese interest and who acted, and sometimes they were even hired by CEFC, by the Chinese company, to act on the Chinese behalf in the Czech Republic.
Does it have anything to do with the ideology? You're talking about social democrats, China is communist. Is ideology at play here?
I'm not certain it's only ideology, because the main U-turn of Czech foreign policy was actually started by the right-wing government, and only then Social Democrats got into power within a very short period of time, actually. But the main parties here, be it Social Democratic Party and being it Social Democrats, are both actually internally divided on China issue. So there are proponents and opponents in both of those parties. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily an ideology thing. It was probably a question of personal profit, as they basically facilitated a number of assets changing hands from the Czech side to Chinese side, with some side money actually being used by those lobbyists. So I would say that it was probably a package of opportunism, real believing into what they are doing, piece of ideology in the end. Difficult to say, probably different motivation by different actors.
And on the Chinese side, who are the main actors of influence?
It used to be the Chinese company known as CFC, who collapsed before COVID, and it had to be bailed out by the CITIC, by the state-owned company. So this was one of the
Chinese or
by
Czech?
The Chinese state-owned company. So that was one of the, let's say, vehicles which was quite visible here in the Czech Republic, investing in various assets, brewery, hotels, sport clubs, and so on. The other one, of course, is the Chinese embassy, but that's quite a visible actor, or the one which is the usual suspect, if I put it this way. And then the intermediaries played quite an interesting role, and these were all Czech nationals.
Politicians or businessmen?
Both. Politicians, businessmen, politicians turned businessmen, and so on.
I know that in some countries the so-called Confucius institutes are also very active in promoting Chinese soft power. Is it the case for the Czech Republic too?
Czech Republic has two Confucius institutes. One is located at University, Palacký University in Olomouc, and the other one is located here in Prague at the private university. Both of the Confucius institutes are quite, I would say, heavily under the spotlight, so they are quite scrutinized, and more or less you can't really say that they would do anything of particular interest in the Czech Republic. The more problematic part of that is more of a hidden influence over local academia than the Confucius Institutes, which are basically forerunners and quite, as I said, quite the usual suspects. There was a case of Chinese embassy secretly funding the local researchers working for the Charles University. They had a course called Belt and Road Initiative, where they basically lectured, let's say, very, very biased information to the local students. What was, of course, more difficult for me to swallow as a researcher, as an academic as well, was the fact that they also profiled students and then gave information on the prospective students to the Chinese embassy. And those prospective students were later on invited to fully funded trips to China. So that was more of a hidden influence, and it came after investigative reporters actually found the invoices which the researchers sent to Chinese embassy.
So this scandal was disclosed?
The scandal was disclosed. The researchers were sacked from the university. They had links to Social Democratic Party, probably not surprisingly, but that's how it basically ended. The Czech-China Research Center, which facilitated this exchange of information as well with the Chinese embassy, was dissolved, so it doesn't function anymore.
The Chinese Communist Party is notorious for its almost total control of people in terms of their surveillance in the Republic of China. Although obviously the CCP does not have the same technical capabilities in Europe, still there are reports that the Chinese are also spying on Chinese citizens living in Europe. Are these reports true, and what about the Czech Republic?
Well, there hasn't been done a research on that to quantify actually the extent of surveillance by the Chinese embassy over, let's say, local or Chinese researchers and Chinese students. On the other hand, from personal experience, I can testify to the fact that Chinese students are under the surveillance of the fellow students. So there is always someone who is taking care of the rest of the group. Which is quite an unfortunate, of course, when those students are requested to, let's say, debate Chinese internal politics or debate Chinese relationship to Taiwan or Hong Kong or Xinjiang or human rights abuses and so on. Because they are studying at the European University, they're expected to have unbiased professional assessment, analytical assessment of the situation. And they are requested to actually publicly talk about that during the class discussions. On the other hand, they know that there is someone sitting who is taking notes or who is paying attention. In the same time, they're all asked to install, to become a member of the WeChat group for exchange of information, how they live in the Czech Republic, what kind of troubles they may encounter, and so on. One of the members of this specific WeChat group is, of course, the Chinese embassy here in Prague. So once again, I wouldn't probably call it a direct surveillance, but definitely there is an attempt to keep an eye on students, how they behave, what they discuss, and so on.
This seems to be a challenge to the integrity of education here in the Czech Republic. Cannot universities do anything about this?
There's a lot of things they can actually do about that. The question is how big of a problem they think it is. Chinese students don't compose a big portion of the student body here, so it's basically in hundreds, not in thousands or tens of thousands. So far, not some kind of systemic approach was actually made. One way how to tackle that, of course, is to ask or to offer Chinese students or any other students, if they wish, they don't have to participate in class discussions. They can turn in papers anonymously, for example, or just to the tutor so nobody else sees that. It became more problematic during the COVID, during the online sessions. Some of the students had to actually use VPNs, which are not allowed in China, to connect to the classroom from China. So it creates a lot of moral dilemmas for the researchers and for the academics as well. So there are ways how to tackle it, and the Czech Republic is not some kind of exception. The same approach has been, or the same problem has been observed, and the same approach has been taken by academics in the United States, UK, and so on. Australia is a good example as well.
Shifting the focus to more recent events, we know that China has publicly supported Russia in its approach towards the expansion of the NATO security umbrella. Why do you think China did this? Well, they perfectly knew, I presume, that the main sponsor of security in Central Eastern Europe is NATO. And China's approach, or China's siding with Russia, it basically undermined its own position in Central Eastern Europe.
Well, it was stupid. What can I say? Well, the narrative which was pumped to Central and Eastern European countries in local languages in various forms, coming from China Radio International, which broadcasts in some of the languages in Central and Eastern Europe, coming from the OPADs, which were written by ambassadors or chargé d'affaires, or coming through various dubious think tanks or alternative media and so on. The narrative was exactly the same as the narrative which was targeting the global south. So basically, once again, seeing Central and Eastern Europeans as the developing countries, as the global south. So it was quite irrational and stupid, frankly, to tell Central and Eastern European countries that they essentially are responsible for Russian invasion to Ukraine because they accessed NATO. They enlarged the grouping, and it's their own fault. So, and they should support the Chinese position and the Russian position. So, completely illogical, completely messed up approach towards propaganda. But it showed a couple of interesting things. First of all, once again, that the narrative is really universal for China to pump to local audiences. It may not resonate in Central and Eastern European countries for obvious reasons. But it may very well resonate in developing countries, which do see NATO quite differently than Central and Eastern Europeans. It may resonate in Western Balkans as well, in Serbia for obvious reasons. So we should probably just leave our Eurocentrism, Eurozone, and look at the things from the global perspective. That's The example I like to use is that when the NATO was looking for headquarters in Africa, none of the African countries actually wanted to host it. So now the headquarters is in Germany. So we may actually laugh at the way how China is distributing the narratives about the whole war in Ukraine and who started what and so on. But it may actually, in global terms, actually resonate quite well.
You don't sound very optimistic about Chinese influence in the Czech Republic and in Europe in general. But what can be done? What can be done to decrease this Chinese malign influence in Europe?
Right, there's plethora of tools which could be used, but I'm afraid that we will have to actually do the homework on our side first. We may actually start with limiting Chinese and Russian influence and all the other loopholes, security loopholes we may have in our legislation system, in our societies, and so on. And that would be one first step to actually do, to look at the data protection mechanisms to increase the freedom of speech and at the same time basically limit what constitutes propaganda and what constitutes harmful narratives, and also to ramp up on strategic communication and promotion actually of our values, to towards the citizens and selling the European Union and NATO and so on and the other organizations better in the Czech Republic, but elsewhere as well. So that would be more on the home front, let's say. But in the same time, what the member states have to do is to do a very painful job, which nobody wants to do really, is to look at media literacy, look really at the society at large, how to include basically everyone so nobody feels left out. So there are no extreme parties, but basically there could be extreme parties, but there are no voters for the extreme parties. And as I said, sometimes the media literacy and, let's say, pre-bunking of certain narratives is downplayed or looked down upon because it's not sexy for politicians. It's something which you have to do on a long-term basis and have to actually invest a lot. And that basically goes beyond 4-year cycle of elections. But it's quite effective. We had a good case in the Czech Republic after the invasion of Ukraine, that majority of the population, basically overwhelming majority of the population, supported Ukraine and supported basically the government's actions to help Ukraine. And they didn't subscribe, the population didn't subscribe to the narrative that Russia is completely innocent, that Russia was provoked by NATO to actually attack Ukraine. And the reason for that was that before that we had an event of explosion of ammunition depot in Vrbětice, which was very well described in the Czech media, with lots of quite strong arguments showing that the explosion was actually conducted by the Russian intelligence service, and person or two people, I think, died during the ammunition depot explosion. And after that, the Czech Republic expelled a huge number of Russian diplomats, which were basically here on the pretext of being diplomat, but were actually involved in espionage. So that was the case which helped the Czech society to prepare for the fact that Russia basically attacked Ukraine and how to frame it. And that helped really the government to successfully communicate to the public that this is one another act of basically state terrorism, of basically criminal act by the Russian state, and it was well accepted by the population. So more active pre-bunking, more active working with the local society is something which is necessary, though I said it's not very sexy.
Thank you very much for this conversation, Ivana.
Thank you, Anton.